It was just another bright, sunny afternoon in a small town when the calm of the day was broken by an unexpected encounter. A black woman, known for her calm demeanor and professional attitude, was going about her day when she was pulled over by a police officer. She had been driving down a quiet street, minding her own business, when she saw the flashing lights in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought it might just be a routine stop, like the many others she'd seen or heard about. Maybe a simple traffic violation like speeding or a broken taillight. But as the officer approached her car, she started to feel an unsettling tension in the air. She lowered the window and greeted the officer politely. His response, however, was cold and distant, a stark contrast to the warm weather surrounding them. The officer asked for her driver's license and registration, which she quickly handed over. Her heart raced a bit, not because she was worried about anything she had done wrong, but because something about the officer's demeanor seemed off. There was an edge to his voice, a sharpness that didn't seem justified by the situation. As she sat there waiting for the officer to return to his car, she began to wonder why he hadn't just let her off with a warning, as she had heard others being treated before. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She was just a woman driving down a street. But when the officer returned to her car, it was clear that he had something else in mind. Instead of giving her a ticket or sending her on her way, he began questioning her more aggressively. His tone was harsh, and he started asking her questions that seemed irrelevant to the situation. "Where are you coming from?" he demanded. "What's your business in this part of town?" His voice had a sharp, almost accusatory edge, and it became clear to her that this wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore. She tried to remain calm, replying that she had been out running errands. But the officer didn't seem satisfied with her answers. He started making comments that didn't sit well with her. "You know, people like you don't belong here," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for her to hear. The words hit her like a punch in the gut, and for a moment, she froze. She wasn't sure if she had heard him right, but there was no mistaking the meaning behind his words. She took a deep breath and tried to remain composed, but the officer's behavior was becoming more aggressive by the second. He accused her of being uncooperative and started to raise his voice. She knew that she had to stay calm, but she couldn't help feeling her frustration building. How could this be happening? Why was she being treated like this when she had done nothing wrong? Before she could say anything else, the officer pulled her out of the car and placed her in handcuffs. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," he said, as if it made any sense. She couldn't believe it. She was being arrested for something she hadn't even done. It was as if he had already made up his mind about her before even speaking to her. And what's worse, his actions weren't about enforcing the law. They were about something deeper, something more personal. The woman was left standing there in disbelief. The officer was still treating her like she was guilty of something, even though she had done nothing but drive down the street. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but it was clear that the truth didn't matter. It never had. As she was taken to the police station, she couldn't help but feel the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much bigger. Something that she would soon find herself in the middle of, whether she was ready for it or not. And little did she know, this encounter would set off a chain of events that would change everything. This was only the beginning of a journey that would reveal a deeper truth, not just about her, but about the system, the officer, and the people who had been watching from the sidelines. What had started as a routine traffic stop was about to turn into something much more significant than anyone could have imagined. The arrest was just the beginning of a much larger problem. As the woman was driven to the police station, she couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It felt surreal. She had always been careful to follow the rules, to be polite, to stay calm in stressful situations. But none of that seemed to matter now. The officer had treated her with such aggression, and for reasons she couldn't understand. His words, his actions, seemed rooted in something much deeper, something that went beyond a simple misunderstanding or a minor traffic violation. At the police station, She was processed like any other person arrested, despite the fact that she knew deep down that she didn't belong here. She wasn't a criminal, yet everything about the situation felt designed to make her feel like she was. The officer's attitude had been so hostile and dismissive, and now she was being treated like a suspect without any real cause. As she sat in the holding cell, she couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind. What had really happened during that traffic stop? Why had the officer been so aggressive with her from the very beginning? It didn't add up. She was just a woman going about her day, not causing any harm. She had been respectful and calm. But none of that mattered to the officer. Her frustration grew as she thought about the officer's comments. "People like you don't belong here," he had said. She couldn't shake the feeling that these words weren't just about her. They were about something bigger. He didn't just see her as a person. He saw her as a stereotype. He was judging her based on her appearance, not her actions. It wasn't about her behavior. It was about his bias, his preconceived notions about who she was simply because of the color of her skin. When she was finally released on bail, she didn't feel any better. In fact, she felt worse. The whole experience had shaken her to the core. She knew that something needed to be done about what had happened. It wasn't just about her. This was something that affected everyone. If a law-abiding citizen like her could be treated this way, what was happening to others who didn't have the same resources or support? Determined not to let this slide, she began to think about how she could make sure this didn't happen to anyone else. As a person with a background in law, she knew that she had the knowledge and the experience to take action. She had seen, firsthand, how the justice system could be manipulated, how people in positions of power could hide behind their authority and get away with mistreatment. But now she was on the other side of the system, and it felt different. She knew that speaking up wasn't just important for her, but for everyone who had been unfairly treated because of their race. Her phone began to ring, and when she answered, it was a local reporter wanting to get her side of the story. The news of her arrest had already spread across social media, with people demanding answers. People were angry, and they weren't just angry at the officer. They were angry at the system that allowed this kind of behavior to go unchecked. At first, she wasn't sure if she should speak out. It was one thing to fight back in the legal system, but putting herself in the public eye was a different matter. But then she realized that staying silent wouldn't help anyone. If she didn't speak up, nothing would change. She owed it to herself, to the people who were supporting her, and to those who had been through similar experiences to make her voice heard. The decision to go public wasn't easy, but she knew it was the right one. She agreed to an interview with a reporter, and in the conversation, she spoke from the heart. She didn't hold back. She talked about the treatment she had received, about the way the officer had made assumptions about her based solely on her race. She shared how it felt to be judged by someone who didn't see her as an individual, but as part of a group he had already decided was inferior. Her words were powerful, and they began to resonate with many people. The more she spoke out, the more she realized that this was bigger than just her story. It was a reflection of a much larger problem. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their race. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but she felt a sense of purpose now. The truth was finally coming to light, and it felt like the start of something much bigger. As the story of her arrest continued to spread, the woman found herself at the center of a growing movement. What had started as a personal ordeal was quickly turning into something much larger. People from all walks of life were reaching out to her, offering their support and sharing their own stories of discrimination and injustice. Social media became a platform where people could express their anger and frustration, and the hashtag Justice for Her began to trend, spreading far beyond her small town. At first, she felt overwhelmed by the attention. She had never expected her simple act of standing up for herself to spark such a response. But as more people spoke out, it became clear to her that her story resonated with so many others. She wasn't alone in her experience. Far too many people had faced the same treatment, whether it was from law enforcement or from others in positions of power. Her arrest was just a small example of a much bigger problem, one that had been ignored for far too long. The calls for justice began to grow louder. Local activists, community leaders, and even some politicians started to take notice of what had happened. Many of them spoke out against the officers' actions, condemning the blatant racial profiling and discrimination that had taken place. They called for an investigation into the police department and demanded that the officer involved be held accountable for his actions. It wasn't just about the woman anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been unfairly treated or targeted because of their race. The media played a huge role in bringing attention to the case. News outlets across the country picked up the story, and it quickly became a topic of national discussion. People from all over the world expressed their support for the woman, and the message of racial injustice spread far and wide. What had started as a local incident was now part of a larger conversation about racism in law enforcement and the need for systemic change. In the days that followed, the woman received messages of encouragement from people she had never met. Some shared stories of their own encounters with police officers, others expressed their admiration for her bravery in speaking out. But there were also messages of hate, angry messages from people who believed that she was making a big deal out of nothing, or that she was simply trying to stir up trouble. But no matter how many hateful comments she received, she refused to back down. She knew she was doing the right thing. The pressure on the police department grew as more and more people demanded answers. The officer who had arrested her, once seen as an unquestioned authority figure, was now facing intense scrutiny. Investigators began looking into his past, digging into complaints and previous accusations of misconduct. It became clear that this wasn't the first time he had exhibited racist behavior. In fact, there were numerous reports from other individuals who had experienced similar treatment at his hands. The officer's actions had not been isolated. He was part of a much larger pattern of discriminatory behavior within the department. As the investigation continued, the woman's confidence grew. She had started this fight alone, but now she had a whole community standing behind her. People from all over were rallying around her cause, attending protests, signing petitions, and writing letters demanding justice. The support was overwhelming, and she began to realize just how many people were ready for change. Her legal team also began working tirelessly to build a case against the officer. They gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and worked to expose the officer's biased behavior. As the case progressed, it became clear that the evidence was stacking up against him. The officer's own words, captured on body camera footage, were damning. He had made racist remarks, both to the woman and in private conversations, revealing a deep-seated prejudice that was hard to ignore. The woman's courage and determination had sparked a movement, one that was pushing for accountability and change. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about reforming the entire system. People were demanding that law enforcement agencies take responsibility for their actions, and that they be held accountable for the ways in which they treated people based on their race. Through it all, the woman never wavered in her commitment to the cause. She knew that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been treated unfairly. She had started this journey with a simple desire for justice, but now she understood that the fight was much bigger. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to face it. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a future where everyone, regardless of their skin color, could feel safe and treated with dignity and respect. As the days passed, the woman found herself caught in the whirlwind of her growing public case. What had once seemed like a private issue was now a full-blown national conversation about racial profiling and police misconduct. The support she was receiving from people all over was overwhelming, but it also made her realize just how deep the problem went. Her arrest had been the spark, but the fire it had started was burning much brighter than she could have imagined. The truth was now out in the open, and people were finally talking about the difficult realities that many had faced for years. While the community rallied around her, demanding justice and accountability, the woman knew the fight wasn't going to be easy. The police department wasn't going to just accept the truth and admit that one of their officers had done wrong. They would fight back, defend their own, and try to cover up any wrongdoings. She knew it wouldn't be a smooth journey, but she felt stronger with every message of support she received. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had been unfairly treated by the system. Investigators began looking into Officer Bradley's past, and what they found was shocking. This wasn't the first time the officer had acted in a racially biased way. In fact, there were several other reports from different individuals who had been treated unfairly by him during traffic stops or other interactions. His behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern of misconduct. What's worse, it seemed that he had been able to get away with it for years. The department had swept complaints under the rug, allowing him to continue his work without facing any serious consequences. As the evidence against him began to pile up, the woman felt a growing sense of determination. She knew that exposing his actions was just the beginning. The whole system needed to change. The focus was no longer just on the officer, but on the way that law enforcement, as a whole, allowed racial bias to persist unchecked. It was clear that the issue was not just about one bad officer. It was about the culture within the police force that allowed such behavior to thrive. Public opinion continued to build against the officer, and soon the pressure on the police department was too much to ignore. There was talk of an internal investigation, but many people felt that it was too little, too late. The damage had already been done. This wasn't just about firing one officer. It was about creating real change in how police interacted with the communities they served. The woman's case had highlighted something much bigger than any one person, and people were demanding answers. Meanwhile, the woman's personal life was changing in ways she hadn't expected. While she had always been an advocate for justice, she had never imagined being at the center of such a high-profile case. Yet, as she continued to speak out and share her experiences, she felt empowered. She was no longer just a victim of a bad situation. She was a symbol of resistance, of strength, and of the fight for a better, more just system. Her legal team worked tirelessly, gathering more evidence and interviewing witnesses who had seen the officer's biased actions firsthand. They combed through his past, digging up every complaint, every instance of misconduct, and presenting it in a way that left no room for denial. The truth was out there, and it was clear that the officer had to be held accountable for his actions. As the trial approached, the woman continued to receive support from her community and beyond. Protests were organized, petitions circulated, and people from all walks of life took a stand, showing that this fight was far from over. It wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about all the people who had ever been mistreated because of their race. It was about bringing attention to the need for change and ensuring that this kind of injustice would not continue unchecked. The road to justice was long and difficult, but the woman never lost sight of what was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a future where people, no matter their skin color, could walk down the street without fear of being judged or mistreated. The support she received, the courage she felt, and the momentum building behind her were all signs that change was possible. And with every step she took, she moved closer to making that change a reality. After the trial, life began to settle into a new rhythm for the woman. The case had been a turning point, not just for her, but for many others. She was still processing everything that had happened. The long months of uncertainty, the support from so many people, the powerful moment when the officer had been held accountable. But even though the verdict had brought a sense of justice, it didn't erase the emotional toll the whole experience had taken on her. In the weeks following the trial, the woman started receiving countless messages of gratitude from people she didn't even know. Some sent personal notes, sharing their own stories of how they had been mistreated by law enforcement, or how her courage had inspired them to speak out about their own experiences. Many of them thanked her for showing that one person could stand up and make a difference. It was heartwarming, but it was also overwhelming. She had never expected to become the face of such a big movement, and at times she felt the weight of it all. But she knew she couldn't stop now. The victory in the courtroom was just one part of a larger fight. She had experienced firsthand the flaws in the system, the racial bias, the lack of accountability, the way certain people were treated simply because of their skin color. While this one officer had been held accountable, there were many others like him who still needed to be confronted. And the culture of prejudice within law enforcement wasn't going to change overnight. The woman knew this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. With her new platform, she became involved in organizations that were fighting for police reform. She met with community leaders, worked with legal experts, and joined protests calling for changes to the way law enforcement interacted with marginalized communities. She started speaking at events, sharing her story, and advocating for stronger policies that would prevent what had happened to her from happening to anyone else. She knew that lasting change couldn't happen without people coming together to demand it. It wasn't enough to just hold one officer accountable. It was about creating a system that treated everyone equally and fairly. One thing the woman focused on was educating others about their rights when interacting with law enforcement. She knew from experience that many people weren't aware of the protections they had, and that lack of knowledge often made them more vulnerable to abuse. She worked on campaigns that taught people how to stay calm and assertive during police encounters, and what steps they could take if they felt they were being treated unfairly. The woman's message began to spread even further, and soon, her story became a part of larger conversations happening across the country. More people were starting to question the way law enforcement handled certain situations, and many were pushing for reforms in policing practices. She was invited to participate in town halls, panels, and discussions with lawmakers. Even though the journey ahead was long and full of challenges, she was no longer just a passive observer. She had become an active part of a movement calling for accountability, transparency, and change. But amidst all the advocacy and public attention, the woman still had moments where she felt the weight of her experience. At times, she would wake up and remember the fear and uncertainty she had felt when she was arrested, and the way the officer had treated her. She often thought about how different the outcome might have been if she had not spoken up, or if she had let fear control her. But then she remembered the strength she had found in herself. Her courage had made a difference, and it was making an even bigger difference now, as the conversation about racial bias in law enforcement continued to grow. She also received support from unexpected places. Some members of law enforcement reached out, expressing their own concerns about the state of policing. They admitted that the system needed change and that too often, officers were not held accountable for their actions. These conversations gave her hope that change was possible from within the system as well. She began to work with those who were genuinely interested in reform, listening to their ideas and offering suggestions on how to improve relationships between police and the communities they served. As time passed, the woman's role as an advocate for justice continued to evolve. She knew the fight for equality and fairness was far from over, but she was no longer facing it alone. The support of countless individuals and organizations was a reminder that together, they could make a real difference. Each conversation, each protest, each call for change was a step forward, and with each small victory, she felt the world slowly shifting toward a place where people of all backgrounds could feel safe, respected, and heard. Though her journey had started with a moment of personal injustice, it had blossomed into something much larger. The woman had become a voice for change, for fairness, and for the idea that no one should ever be judged or treated unfairly based on the color of their skin. And as long as there were people willing to listen and take action, she knew that the future would be brighter for everyone. After the trial, life began to settle into a new rhythm for the woman. The case had been a turning point, not just for her, but for many others. She was still processing everything that had happened. The long months of uncertainty, the support from so many people, the powerful moment when the officer had been held accountable. But even though the verdict had brought a sense of justice, it didn't erase the emotional toll the whole experience had taken on her. In the weeks following the trial, The woman started receiving countless messages of gratitude from people she didn't even know. Some sent personal notes, sharing their own stories of how they had been mistreated by law enforcement, or how her courage had inspired them to speak out about their own experiences. Many of them thanked her for showing that one person could stand up and make a difference. It was heartwarming, but it was also overwhelming. She had never expected to become the face of such a big movement, and at times she felt the weight of it all. But she knew she couldn't stop now. The victory in the courtroom was just one part of a larger fight. She had experienced firsthand the flaws in the system, the racial bias, the lack of accountability, the way certain people were treated simply because of their skin color. While this one officer had been held accountable, there were many others like him who still needed to be confronted. And the culture of prejudice within law enforcement wasn't going to change overnight. The woman knew this was only the beginning of a much longer journey. With her new platform, she became involved in organizations that were fighting for police reform. She met with community leaders, worked with legal experts, and joined protests calling for changes to the way law enforcement interacted with marginalized communities. She started speaking at events, sharing her story, and advocating for stronger policies that would prevent what had happened to her from happening to anyone else. She knew that lasting change couldn't happen without people coming together to demand it. It wasn't enough to just hold one officer accountable. It was about creating a system that treated everyone equally and fairly. One thing the woman focused on was educating others about their rights when interacting with law enforcement. She knew from experience that many people weren't aware of the protections they had, and that lack of knowledge often made them more vulnerable to abuse. She worked on campaigns that taught people how to stay calm and assertive during police encounters, and what steps they could take if they felt they were being treated unfairly. The woman's message began to spread even further, and soon, her story became a part of larger conversations happening across the country. More people were starting to question the way law enforcement handled certain situations, and many were pushing for reforms in policing practices. She was invited to participate in town halls, panels, and discussions with lawmakers. Even though the journey ahead was long and full of challenges, she was no longer just a passive observer. She had become an active part of a movement calling for accountability, transparency, and change. But amidst all the advocacy and public attention, the woman still had moments where she felt the weight of her experience. At times, she would wake up and remember the fear and uncertainty she had felt when she was arrested, and the way the officer had treated her. She often thought about how different the outcome might have been if she had not spoken up, or if she had let fear control her. But then she remembered the strength she had found in herself. Her courage had made a difference, and it was making an even bigger difference now, as the conversation about racial bias in law enforcement continued to grow. She also received support from unexpected places. Some members of law enforcement reached out, expressing their own concerns about the state of policing. They admitted that the system needed change and that too often, officers were not held accountable for their actions. These conversations gave her hope that change was possible from within the system as well. She began to work with those who were genuinely interested in reform, listening to their ideas and offering suggestions on how to improve relationships between police and the communities they served. As time passed, the woman's role as an advocate for justice continued to evolve. She knew the fight for equality and fairness was far from over, but she was no longer facing it alone. The support of countless individuals and organizations was a reminder that together, they could make a real difference. Each conversation, each protest, each call for change was a step forward, and with each small victory, she felt the world slowly shifting toward a place where people of all backgrounds could feel safe, respected, and heard. As the woman continued her advocacy for justice, she realized how much her life had changed since that day of her arrest. It felt as though a lifetime had passed, but at the same time, she knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The journey ahead wasn't going to be easy, and there would be more challenges to face. But the woman felt a deep sense of purpose now. She knew that the fight for justice and equality wasn't something that could be won in a single battle. It was an ongoing process, one that would require persistence, unity, and a constant push for change. One of the biggest lessons she learned was the importance of listening. She met so many people, all with their own experiences of injustice, and each person had their own story to tell. Hearing those stories made her realize just how deep the problem ran. It wasn't just about police officers, it was about a society that had been conditioned to tolerate inequality for far too long. Listening to those who had been directly affected by racial profiling and injustice became a key part of her activism. She knew that in order to create real change, it wasn't enough to speak for others. It was important to allow people to speak for themselves, to share their experiences, and to be heard. She also began to understand the importance of having difficult conversations. It was easy for people to pretend that things were fine or to avoid talking about race, especially in certain communities. But she knew that silence would only allow the injustice to persist. She took it upon herself to speak at schools, town halls, and community meetings, encouraging others to start talking about these issues. The more people talked about the problems, the more likely it was that real solutions would emerge. As her message spread, more people began to join the movement. What had started as a small group of people supporting her grew into a large, diverse coalition of activists, lawyers, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who were all fighting for the same cause. They worked together, organizing marches, petition drives, and meetings with lawmakers to push for changes in policies and practices that allowed racial bias to continue in law enforcement. The support was overwhelming, and it made her feel like she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. But it also reminded her that there was still so much work to do. Change was happening, but it was slow. While the officer involved in her case had been held accountable, that didn't mean that everything was fixed. Far too many others were still experiencing the same kinds of discrimination and injustice every day. The woman was aware that her case had become a symbol, but she didn't want the focus to remain solely on her. She knew that the struggle for racial equality was much bigger than her experience. It was about a culture of policing that needed to be reformed, about creating a system where no one would be treated unfairly because of their skin color. And that kind of change, she knew, would require much more than a courtroom victory. It would take a widespread cultural shift. As the months passed, her activism began to shift toward long-term solutions. She worked with experts on reforming police training, focusing on educating officers about implicit bias and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. She advocated for the introduction of more community-based policing, where officers could build stronger relationships with the neighborhoods they served, and she pushed for policies that would make it easier to hold law enforcement accountable for misconduct. Her work started to attract the attention of politicians and lawmakers who were beginning to realize the need for reform. They invited her to speak with them, to share her perspective, and to help shape the conversation about how to make real, lasting changes in the system. She found herself in meetings with decision-makers, explaining what needed to be done to create a more just and fair society. Although the road to change was long, she was encouraged by the fact that the conversation was finally happening on a larger scale. There were still moments of doubt, of course. She would sometimes wonder if her efforts were enough, if the changes being made were really going to have a lasting impact. But when she heard the stories of others who were finding their voices, who were standing up in their communities, she knew that things were moving in the right direction. Change wouldn't come overnight, but it was happening, bit by bit, with every conversation, every protest, and every action taken. As the woman continued her advocacy for justice, she felt both grateful and humbled by the support she received. What had started as a single, personal battle had transformed into something much bigger. She was no longer just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated or discriminated against. The movement was gaining momentum, and it was clear that people across the country were starting to demand change. However, while progress was being made, the woman knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still so many battles ahead. One of the most important things she realized was that systemic change required persistence. Change wasn't going to happen quickly, and it certainly wouldn't happen without ongoing effort. She learned that fighting for justice meant being consistent, even when things felt discouraging. Sometimes, progress felt slow, and the weight of the work was heavy. But every conversation, every protest, and every story shared added to the growing movement. It was a reminder that small actions, when combined, could create a huge impact over time. The woman also understood the importance of empowering others to speak out. She met so many individuals who had been through similar experiences, but felt too afraid or powerless to share their stories. Many people, particularly those from marginalized communities, feared the consequences of speaking up, worried they wouldn't be believed, or that their voices wouldn't matter. But she knew how powerful it was to hear someone else's story, to feel less alone. She worked hard to create spaces where people could safely share their experiences, whether in person or online. She believed that the more people spoke up, the more it would encourage others to do the same. When voices came together, they could create a powerful force for change. In her work, the woman started collaborating with other organizations focused on criminal justice reform. Together, they launched programs aimed at educating the public about racial profiling and police bias. They worked with schools to teach young people about their rights and how to handle interactions with law enforcement. They also helped create resources for communities so people could better understand the legal system and how to navigate it. The goal was not only to raise awareness, but to equip individuals with the tools they needed to protect themselves and their rights. The conversations about police reform also expanded beyond just the local level. Many lawmakers began to pay closer attention, realizing that this wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a widespread problem that required action. The woman was invited to speak at forums and discussions with policymakers, where she shared her perspective on what needed to change. One of the things she pushed for was more accountability in policing. It wasn't enough to just talk about the issue. There needed to be real consequences for officers who engaged in discriminatory behavior. Holding law enforcement accountable would send a clear message that racial bias would no longer be tolerated. As the conversation around police reform continued, it was clear that people were starting to think more critically about the systems in place. It wasn't just about one officer or one incident anymore. It was about addressing the root causes of inequality. The woman was heartened by the fact that more people were starting to challenge the status quo. People were starting to ask difficult questions. Why had things been allowed to continue this way? Why had certain groups been targeted for so long? And most importantly, what could be done to fix it? There were moments when the woman felt exhausted, when it seemed like things were moving slower than she had hoped. She sometimes wondered if all the efforts would really lead to the lasting change she envisioned. But then, she would receive messages from people whose lives had been touched by her work. Messages from people who had found the courage to speak up, who had joined the fight for justice, and who were determined to make a difference. Those messages reminded her why she had started this journey in the first place. She wasn't alone in this fight, and neither were the countless others who had been mistreated or silenced for far too long. The support continued to grow, and more people were getting involved in the movement. It wasn't just about protesting or holding rallies. It was about making systemic changes that would ensure everyone, regardless of their race, would be treated fairly by the police. The woman worked alongside leaders in the movement to push for changes to police training, reforms to stop and frisk policies, and stronger protections for people in vulnerable communities. She also advocated for changes in the way police departments were held accountable, calling for more transparency and stricter regulations to prevent abuses of power. As the woman continued her journey, she began to see just how much her story had impacted others. The journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. From the moment of her arrest to the long months in court, and now to the work she was doing to make lasting change, she had grown stronger, more determined, and more hopeful than ever. Every day, she found herself reflecting on how far she had come and how much more there was still to do. The movement she had helped to build was gaining momentum. What started as a personal battle for justice had become a nationwide conversation about race, law enforcement, and the systems that needed to change. Across the country, more and more people were starting to realize that this was not just a fight for one individual, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color. The woman had become a voice for those who had felt silenced, and she was proud of what they had accomplished together. But even as the movement grew, she knew there was still so much work ahead. While public awareness was rising, real change in the law, in the policies, and in the way people thought would take time. She was determined to stay committed, even when things felt slow or difficult. The woman knew that the road to justice was not a straight path, but one filled with obstacles and setbacks. Yet she also knew that the fight was worth it, and she had come to believe that the more people joined the cause, the greater the chance for lasting change. One thing that kept her going was the faces of the people she met along the way. The countless individuals who had experienced similar struggles and were now standing alongside her, sharing their stories, and working together to make things better. They were people who understood the pain of being judged based on the color of their skin, but they were also people filled with hope. They wanted to make sure that future generations would not have to face the same challenges. Their strength and resilience fueled her own determination. The woman often spoke to young people, hoping to inspire them to get involved and to stand up for what was right. She saw in them the future of the movement. They were the ones who would carry the torch forward, challenging the injustices of the past and creating a more just world for everyone. She knew that by educating and empowering the younger generation, they would be able to continue the work of change long after she was gone. One of the most rewarding parts of her journey was when people came to her to share how her story had helped them. Whether it was someone telling her that they now felt confident enough to stand up to authority, or someone who had found the courage to speak out about their own experiences with police discrimination, the woman realized how far-reaching her efforts had become. Each person who found their voice added strength to the movement, and each person who felt empowered to make a change was part of a larger, collective effort. As her influence continued to grow, the woman used her platform to encourage even more conversations. She didn't just want to highlight the problems. She wanted to help find solutions. She worked with policymakers, experts in criminal justice reform, and community leaders to create actionable plans that could lead to lasting change. She pushed for better training for law enforcement officers, more community-based policing programs, and changes in laws that would help ensure that racial profiling and discrimination would no longer be tolerated. She also continued to challenge people to rethink the way they saw the world. Change didn't just happen in courts or in police departments. It needed to start in communities, in homes, and in schools. The woman encouraged people to examine their own biases and to take action, no matter how small, to create a more equal and just society. Through it all, she learned the power of community. She realized that change wasn't just about one person or one event. It was about the collective action of many. It was about standing together, speaking out, and supporting each other. And while the challenges were many, the woman was confident that together, they could make a difference. Looking back on everything, she felt proud of the progress that had been made. The journey was far from over, but she knew that with every person who joined the cause, with every story shared, and with every act of resistance against injustice, the world was becoming a little bit better. The woman had started as an individual fighting for herself, but she had become part of something much larger, a movement for equality, fairness, and justice. And that, to her, was the greatest victory of all.